How do you feel about the personality of our country today? I'm really bothered by how polarized we are. I mean, we fight like cats and you may have seen pictures like this of unlikely animal friendships. The successful socialization of dogs and cheetahs at the San Diego Zoo defies the proverbially contentious relationship between dogs and cats, giving hope that it is possible for the dissimilar to live in harmony. I guess my husband and I are not strong enough evidence. There are three things that need to happen for these types of unusual relationships to occur. They are introduced at a very young age, they are in a stressful environment and rely on each other for comfort, or they are living in captivity. I think what is most applicable to what we are experiencing as a culture right now is stress. The stress of an increasingly polarized nation whose citizens feel siloed, marginalized, and even villainized. We see these symbiotic relationships occur naturally outside of captivity as well. If you were a small, edible, and tasty fish, how comfortable would you be entering a large, ferocious predator's mouth to clean its teeth? Let me introduce you to the cleaner wrasse. It has a brilliant business plan in its natural reef habitat. It sets its dining table, it doesn't actually call it that. It's marketed as a cleaning station where large predators like moray eels, grouper, and sharks will stop by, strike a pose, signaling they come in peace and are in need of a good cleaning. The wrasse then gets to work nibbling its entire body, including the inside of its mouth and teeth, getting a good meal in the process. The predator is now freshly exfoliated and parasite-free. The wrasse has a full stomach, and they both walk or swim away from the encounter alive and having benefited. Perfect example of a symbiotic relationship. You may be wondering why a marketing professor who carries livers in her car is talking about the complex hygiene and feeding rituals of fish. I wasn't kidding when I said the normally predatory eel gives a signal as it approaches the wrasse's kitchen table that says, "Hey, I just want to talk. What'd you think? I'm going to eat ya?" I'm no animal scientist, but as a marketer, I am wildly fascinated by the power of signs and symbols and their impact on our interaction with one another. The signal we give is what I want to talk about today. For humans, often the most obvious signals come from our fashion choices. When I say fashion, I'm talking about a much broader definition. Yes, it's clothing, but it's also everything from music, diet fads, keto, anyone? Hairstyles, to interior design, and even things like child-rearing techniques. Terms like tiger mom, helicopter, and free-range parents illustrate this. What is communicated to others by our fashion choices is called fashion discourse. Like the signal from the predator to the wrasse, what we communicate is what I, as a consumer researcher, focus on. Do the things we consume and display have the power to encourage more fruitful interaction with people who are unlike ourselves? Is it possible for consumption, or the lack of, to increase tolerance? I truly believe it can, and I call it symbiotic consumption. At its most basic, symbiotic consumption is the use of fashion discourse to signal a friendly willingness to engage with dissimilar others. It's easiest to explain the concept and its consequences by giving an anti-example. Anyone recognize this? You're probably familiar with the controversy surrounding a recent incident involving Catholic high school students, a Native American, and Black Hebrew Israelites. While the facts and opinions of the situation are still debatable, there has been consensus that the rush to judgment against the Catholic high school students was premature and largely driven by the presence of the MAGA hats. Way more than just an accessory, the MAGA hats acted as a lightning rod that shaped opinions before additional information and context was available. The only context that mattered was the highly visible and meaningful signal sent by the presence of the hats. Think for a moment how the discourse might have been different or how even your initial reaction may have been different if the hats had not been in the photos and videos that quickly went viral. Most people's opinion of the culpability of this young man had little to do with him or his behavior, but were determined by their attitude toward the president and his behavior as represented by the hats. Symbiotic consumption is worth discussing because people feel how divided and polarized our culture is right now. Many of us are looking for ways to understand or bridge the vastness that exists between people with different ideologies and values. Productive conversation and engagement is less likely if we aren't giving the signal to each other that we will do our part to maintain civility, especially when we are interacting with those with whom we strongly disagree. If you want more pleasant, civil, and beneficial interactions, you need to be willing to be the first one to give that signal through your fashion discourse. I get this may sound a little vanilla, and you're skeptical about the ability of symbiotic consumption to solve the ideological divide on issues like immigration, abortion, and guns. First of all, I am not saying that symbiotic consumption alone will. But I am saying it is a necessary first step to creating an environment in which the types of conversations that will lead to more agreement can take place. If, without the signal, the interaction between the wrasse and eel, it would never happen. Likewise, we set the tone for how interactions with people who are very different than us will go based on the discourse that takes place before we ever even open our mouths. Our fashion discourse has the ability to signal confrontation and narrow-mindedness, or respect and genuine interest in hearing others' ideas. I'm not sure why we're so surprised when provocative symbols actually provoke. When people feel immediately on the defensive before an interaction has even started, there's a greater chance for misunderstanding and a decreased likelihood of active listening and measured speaking without bias. Now, you do not have to, and I am not recommending, that you abandon your strongly held beliefs or values in order to signal that you aren't going to attack those with whom you disagree. The deep divide in our culture will never be repaired, nor will progress towards important policy decisions be made if we can't figure out how to have symbiotic conversations. Without symbiosis and its signal, does it make any sense for prey to enter a predator's mouth? Absolutely not. Why would any animal or person enter into an interaction in which they assumed they were going to be attacked? Research has shown exposure is one of the most powerful ways to increase our acceptance and tolerance. As our culture's perspective on same-sex marriage progressed, the number one reason why people shifted their viewpoint from opposing gay marriage to supporting it was personally knowing someone who is homosexual. Positive exposure to people and ideas that are different than our own increases our acceptance of those differences. Progress cannot be made towards acceptance without positive exposure. If we can become comfortable with the people who hold different ideas, we can become more comfortable and respectful discussing and debating those ideas. We can't expect there to be widespread agreement on policy regulations for an issue like climate change if we can't first experience positive exposure to people who see the issue differently than we do. Positive exposure cannot be expected without being given or ourselves giving the signal that it's safe to get a little closer. If you think this sounds like I'm asking you to be inauthentic, that is not it at all. You don't consider it inauthentic when you want to stay in your sweatpants all day, but your boss and clients have different expectations, so you get appropriately dressed for work. You know you will have better professional interactions if you aren't wearing pajamas. Likewise, you will have better interactions with people who see things differently than you if you leave the provocative symbols that cement you in a narrow ideology at home. I'm not saying you can't ever display them, but if you want to promote positive interaction with dissimilar others, they shouldn't be part of your signal. The ultimate goal of symbiotic consumption is to widen your identity range through fashion discourse so that you can increase the range of people with which you can meaningfully interact. If you cement your identity in a narrow range by always displaying the symbols that communicate a singular group membership, you will limit your exposure and your possible impact. My life experiences have allowed me to really personally understand how effective this approach can be. I grew up in a very conservative and rural area in the Midwest. My dad was an independent fundamental Baptist pastor for over 30 years. I grew up in the church. Now, I am a professor, a profession that is well documented to be quite left of center, in a part of the country that is as well. How have I managed to maintain positive relationships with my family and longtime acquaintances from back home, while also adding colleagues, co-authors, and friends to my network? I strongly attribute it to my use of symbiotic consumption. Doing so does not mean I have less faith or am less educated, or that I feel less strongly about gun rights and environmental issues. But it does mean I am very conscious of what I signal as I enter into each interaction. So how can you be more symbiotic? Start small. Ask yourself, do my social media posts provoke or promote positive exposure to my ideas? Memes are the modern-day bumper sticker, and if you come across something that you really agree with, but it is polarizing and snarky, privately share it with the people you know will appreciate it. I mean, we all love group texts. It doesn't have to be shared publicly for you to enjoy it. Symbiotic consumption is just as much about restraint as it is display. And, like my mama always said, just because you can doesn't mean you should. Don't start politicized conversations with disparaging remarks. For example, if I didn't believe in human-caused climate change, I could ask one of the scientists on my campus, "Where's your global warming now?" after experiencing the snowiest February on record. That's obviously not very symbiotic. Would immediately put them on the defensive and justifiably make them more apprehensive and closed off around me. A much more symbiotic approach would be something like, I'm curious how record cold temperatures and snowfall amounts play into the tracking of global warming. Another really good example from my research of how practicing this concept can build bridges between people is a high school student who uses symbiotic consumption regarding her hair in order to maintain a relationship with her dad. Knowing how much it bothers him, she chose not to actually dye her hair a variety of bold rainbow colors like her friends did, and instead opted for clip-ins and extensions so she can take them in and out as she moves between hanging out with her friends and going home and spending the evening with her dad. This illustrates perfectly how symbiotic consumption can widen your identity range in order to make interaction with more people more likely. She still fits in with her friends and likes the look that she has, but she created it in a way that didn't alienate her from her dad. Evaluate your own consumption and look for ways that you can widen your identity range to include more people rather than narrowing it, increasing the distance between you and those who aren't like you. Remember the picture of the dog and the cheetah in the socialization program? Not all dogs are chosen for that program. They specifically look for dogs who are neither too dominant nor too submissive. That's exactly what symbiotic relationships between people with different ideologies requires as well. People who know what they believe, but who aren't so threatened in the presence of difference that they attack and become defensive rather than open to the exposure that ultimately widens your perspective. I understand not everybody is going to adopt this notion of symbiotic consumption, but if you want to do more than just talk about the division in our country right now, if you want to really understand rather than just complain about people who believe or vote differently than you, we all have to ask ourselves, what signal am I sending? Am I signaling a cemented and narrow ideology? Or am I signaling that I am open and willing to explore our differences? Without the willingness to set aside their predator instincts and signal to the wrasse that they come in peace, the eel would die of a parasitic infection. If, out of fear, the wrasse never responded to the signal given by the eel and refrained from getting close, it would starve. The stakes are just as high for our society. Today, the polarized ideologies and people who represent them face a similar standoff. Do we remain so tied to our ideologies that we refuse to signal a willingness to cooperate, and in so doing, starve ourselves of the benefits that come from widened perspectives and diverse encounters? Do we let the infection of division continue to create this toxic environment that ruins relationships and corrodes our health? I challenge you to choose symbiotic consumption as a first step toward more civil and beneficial interactions with one another. I challenge you to choose being symbiotic over being self-righteous. I challenge you to choose symbiosis over complacency. Thank you.